PLATO. Paul Thompson is one who's been working most closely with me. We'll get into that. Okay, I think we should let our speaker go to it. For those of you who don't know Lou very well, he's been with us for a little while. He lives in Gray Lakes, Illinois. Lou has been active in teaching for some time. He's taught science in various venues, but particularly at the Argonne National Laboratory. And speaking of phones, I can't mute myself, but I'll just shut that off. And so he has a wealth of experience in teaching science, and in particular, he's been active in the Friends of Fishing group for the last year or more, and very helpful in that way. So he's a great person to review this book that he'll be doing right away. So Lou, I think you've spoken to us before, and I've always enjoyed your talks and enjoyed your participation in other talks that have been given. So I have every confidence and interest in hearing about Vaclav Smil. So you're on.
Okay, well, thanks for the warm introduction, Richard. And before I get started, I want to welcome everybody. It looks like we have a really good crowd here today. Thank you for tuning in. This is going to have a lot of overlap with the first two talks that Richard gave. He gave one on climate justice, perhaps even phytoplankton in some capacity. I'm not sure. It's going to have overlap with Mert's talk last spring about methane, and Lee's talk. She talked about you know, how we get our ammonia and fertilizers and things like that. So there's going to be overlap in this. And I'm trying to just cover his thoughts. If I depart from his thoughts, I'll let you know when it's some of my thoughts. Okay. So this is, Vaclav Smil. He is Canadian, I believe a Canadian citizen now. He's at the University of Manitoba. He's 79 years old. I've reviewed this book, How the World Really Works, and it's got a subtitle in there, yeah, which we will. And then I've looked at 3 of his interviews, and you can pull a lot out of his interviews too. They're almost more interesting, easier to read than the book. Is hard to read, actually. It's only 129 pages, but you got to reread parts of it. I would never recommend getting the audio book for this because it'll go right over your head. And also, to qualify one thing, he last edited the book in May 2020. This is before inflation and the Russian-Ukraine war. So he might have had more to say about that. So he says he's not an optimist or a pessimist. He's just a scientist trying to look at what history tells us and look at what he feels we have to do and what's real. Okay. So I don't know why I'm not advancing here. Should be advancing, and for some reason I'm not. Oh, there we go. For some reason. Okay. So to lead off, comparison of today's consumption of fossil fuels to some other things that we might feel. That is, the annual global demand of fossil carbon is 10 billion tons. Okay, this is 5 times the harvest tons of all staple grains feeding humanity per year today, and 2 times the total mass of all water drunk by almost 8 billion people per year today. So we have a mass scale dependency on fossil fuels, and that he tries to get across very quickly. Where do countries rank in energy per capita? These are just a few countries. This is in gigajoules of consumption per person per year. US, of course, leads. Japan is a little more than half of the US. EU is half, and China is a third, and then these are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and they would very much like to be up where China is today. And they want to get over there. Let's see what happens in the decades that unfold. I like to throw this out because I still like this listing of where our energy goes. Bill Gates does a good job with this in his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, which, by the way, is a far easier book to read than Smill's book. So you've seen these before. I'm not going to belabor these, but in aggregate, they equal 100%. And what I'm just kind of a review. I mean, making things is really at the high end. It's more, we always think, well, the grid is the high end. No, it's making things that's really high, and growing things is pretty high too. But what I want you to think about in a couple slides from now, what is the collective share of all of these categories together powered by fossil fuels? And I'm going to show you a slide, not the next one, but maybe the one after. Okay. So this shows how technology, the first point I'm going to make in the book that he makes is, and these are kind of global bullets, it shows how technologies have emerged because of the availability of coal, oil, fission, and methane. I mean, it's the one is reinforcing the other, and you'll see the technologies as we get through this shows how deeply fossil fuels have changed our infrastructure, our quality of life, and fueled our globalization. And that's a play on words, but it's literally fueled our globalization, you'll see. And states that the book states that rapid substitution of 100% fossil fuel energy with clean energy is impossible. And I'll show you a table here. Remember I said what share of those 5 areas is powered by fossil fuel in the year 2000? Was all of these. China was leading. And almost 20 years later, not quite, Japan went up. Well, why did Japan go up? And it's the share of fossil fuels powering the 5 sectors. Well, the answer is Fukushima, okay? That's why it went up. But China went down by 8 points. Germany went down by 6, but it should have went down more because it bolstered 40% of its renewables. A big chunk of renewables went up and it still didn't go down that much. Globally, we are at 83% roughly now. This is an update. It's current, not just in 2019. Didn't go down much. And the International Energy Agency is predicting by 2040 it will be between these two, and this would be very aggressive. But the point Smill makes is 2040 to 2050, when everything's supposed to go carbon neutral, is 10 years. You're going to reduce this percentage in 10 years? He says it'll never happen. And he's probably right. So some other key points of the book, it follows energy, food production, materials production, the 4 pillars, which we'll get to. And then he gets into globalization a little bit. So the energy of the average person is 700 times more useful today than it was in the early 1800s. And food production, wow, we've gone from, in the last 69 years, we've gone from 2.5 billion to 7.7 and fed these people. Now, 9% are food deficient. That doesn't mean they're all starving, but this is the lowest percentage we've ever had in the modern era. It's still pretty low. So and then the last thing is materials production, the 4 pillars. We're going to get into that: mass mobilization of man-made metals, non-metals, synthetic compounds, and so on. Okay, so these 3 areas are pushed in the book again and again. he gets initially into the sequence of the transition of prime movers. These are things that do the work that we need done. And basically in the 1500s, it was animal and human. There were sailing ships and there were windmills that ground wheat and in the Netherlands and so on, but that was very minor. And until the steam engine, did things get a bit better, but they were only running at 10% efficiency. And then we had better steam engines. They got better over time. And then the internal combustion engine, which really took off. And you see in this upper corner, a picture of a Stanley steamer, not the carpet cleaning service, but the old car, antique car. And it burned coal and created steam and had a boiler and all that good stuff. But then the Model T Ford came along and it displaced it. So during the 1900s, you had coal and oil being used in different capacities, okay? Mostly oil-based products for transportation. And then 2000, all of the efficiencies go up quite a bit, and diesel engines really start to dominate a lot of things. Now, we had electric motors back in here too, that ran off the grid and so forth, but he didn't get it much into that. But look at the difference between.
If I can just interrupt, add a little number there for you, Lou. Electric motors operate at about 80% efficiency.
Yeah, they're much higher, for sure. I don't have that in there, but so they blow all these out of the water. But anyway, the amount of capacity to do work increased 3,500 times between the early 1800s and until basically today. That's quite a huge change. So that, and you can see how this evolved, and most of it's really due to, it's all due to fossil fuel, but wood is biofuel, I guess. It's not fossil, but by the way, coal has twice the energy density of wood. So in steam engines, coal dominated and wood fell by the wayside very quickly. All right, we're going to move off of that. Now, he gets into three comparisons, three different valleys, time zones apart. And the first one is in 1801. It's interesting why he puts the one in there, but Genesee Valley in New York. And this is about, what inputs are there to work 1 hectare of land, which is 2.5 acres roughly. Oxen are doing the plowing and the harrowing, and you plow it, you let it dry, you harrow it, work down the clods, and then you sow the seed, and then you let it grow and you collect it in some way. And here's the hours. He's got 150 human hours and 70 oxen hours, 1 ton of grain. And if you divide, figure out the kilograms in a ton of grain based on the hours, you get 10 minutes of human input. HI is human input per kilogram. And that's what we want to remember. Would be 600 seconds right here. And this is just something in passing. 1.6 kilograms equals 2 loaves, something on that order. Those would be big loaves compared to today. So you can see how this is done. They have to beat the wheat on a hard surface to release the grain, and the grain is shown here. You can see that, okay? Now we're going to jump 100 years ahead of this. Now we're in Red River Valley, North Dakota. 4 horse-gang teams pull plows and harrows. I had asked Richard to send this ahead to people, but this is a team horse, 3 sets of 4 horses pulling a 4-bottom plow. It's a video actually. That's really kind of interesting to see a minute of it or so. It's kind of cool how that works, but they got a lot of people working that. It's not just one person. I don't want to skip ahead. So you work the ground, you use mechanical seed drills, which distribute the seed much more evenly. And I don't have a drill to show you what it is, but it's just like a planter kind of thing. And then, mechanically you harvest and cut the stalks and bind them or not. Here they're not bound. And then you feed them into a threshing machine, which is powered by a steam-powered tractor, which we can't see. Not very safe. People could get caught in something could get caught in that. So the 22 human hours, 37 horse hours, 1 ton of grain, 90 seconds of human input per kilogram. Now, the prior example 100 years earlier was 600 seconds. Now we're down to 1/7 of that, something like that. Okay, we move to the current example. This would be basically today. In Arkansas River Valley, huge 400 horsepower tractors pull the plows, apply the fertilizers, work the ground, whatever they have to do, plant the seed, and you have combines, they call them combine harvesters, with huge heads that, separate the seed from the stalk and the chaff and everything all very quickly, and just at huge paces. They're going at a tremendous pace here. So you have 2 human hours and you get 3.5 tons per hectare, 2 seconds of human input per kilogram. So it's gone down considerably from 600 seconds 220 years earlier to now 2 seconds. Okay, it's pretty phenomenal. But what about this extra amount of yield here? What was that due to? Well, what happened was the machining helps, and the diesel fuel certainly helps, but Norman Borlaug crossed 2 different strains of wheat. And the earlier strains look like this. Then he came up with strains that look like this, miracle wheat. And miracle wheat could produce 9 times the amount of grain. But it didn't do that worldwide because it needed a lot of fertilizer to do that. And that wasn't always available. But this got adopted worldwide. This was adopted in Asia, all over the place. And he got a Nobel Peace Prize for that. So that's quite a remarkable thing. But fertilizer starts to become very important. And so this is a graph I showed last spring, energy density graph. You had on the x-axis, you have, mass, and on the y you have volume. But so you can see that, well, hydrogen is very low, and something like coal would be very low. I don't know, coal might be, I don't know, I don't have coal on here somewhere, but it's not very far off. But the point is, you get into your alcohols and finally into your large chain carbon molecules, mixtures of those, and you get gasoline. And beyond gasoline, you get kerosene, jet A fuel, and diesel. Diesel's way at the top. And it just packs a tremendous amount of energy in a kilogram of fuel or a gallon of fuel or whatever. The other beautiful part of liquid fuels is that they're their own built-in energy storage. They store energy for weeks, months, whatever. And that's remarkable. We can't get anything to store energy like that with renewables. It's not there. So, and the other thing too, in an airplane, if you want to switch fuel from one wing to the other, even things out, you can do it with a liquid fuel. You can't do it with coal, can you? You can't do that. All right. So we're going to get into some foodstuffs that he tries to compare the diesel equivalency to obtain. And obviously, when you're making wheat, photosynthesis makes the wheat and has the nutrients from the soil and the water and so forth. But to cultivate the wheat, to get it and seed it and harvest it, takes fuel, takes energy. So that's our diesel equivalent. So he calls it eating fossil fuels, which is not obviously happening. But so we start with 800 grams of wheat to make this bread, and that distills down to 580 grams, and there's this much diesel. And then if you're going to bake it, you get about 250 ml equivalency of diesel. I've got this little scale that, and if you multiply that by 0.13 cents, it's not very much money to make that based on, you know, the diesel fuel driving everything. Okay, then we're going to move to another food stuff and compare it. I love this one, chicken broilers. The fed to live weight is 1.82 to 1, and less than 2 to 1, but edible weight is 3 to 1. So if you need 3 kilograms of corn to help grow 1 kilogram of chicken broiler, okay, that's 50 mLs of diesel. Then you got to maintain the poultry house. That may vary time of year. Let's just say 150 mLs for that. And then if you're going to slaughter the animal and refrigerate it, now cooking I put in parentheses because for a reason, then you get 320. But if you don't cook it, you're going to have something less than that, right? And maybe 280 or somewhere in there. So this is an interesting tidbit. In the US, a kilogram of quality bread is only 5% lower than a kilogram of raw chicken. And actually, I went to the store and it was the other way around. I was finding a pound of raw chicken breast at Meijer was 20 cents cheaper than a pound of brownberry bread. So it was cheaper. It's like, whoa, how can that be? Well, fossil fuels are helping do all this in a large sense. And I'm going to jump to my biology 101 course. And when I teach ecology, you have this energy pyramid. And you guys have probably seen that somewhere where the primary, say you have 100 units of energy produced by plants, and then the primary consumer, an animal or herbivore, eats it. There's only 10 units left for them. And as you go up, there's only 1/10 left. There's only 1 unit here, 1/10 unit. Apex predator only gets 1/100th of that. And then you have the pyramid of biomass, so the point I'm trying to make is it's usually a 10-to-1 ratio of energy efficiency moving through the pyramid. But when we look at these livestock, chicken is 1.8 to 1. It's less than 2 to 1. This is live weight. And so it really is much lower than this 10-to-1 rule. Hogs are, and beef is really high. It's almost 13 to 1. Another reason not to eat beef. It's very high. Okay, maybe you've seen this before, but it struck me as after teaching so much biology, I hadn't noticed it. So then he gets into tomatoes as the third fuel stuff, and they need fertilizer, agrochemicals, water, heat, blah, blah, blah. If it's heated, it's much lower. If it's unheated, it's much lower energy to grow tomatoes. If it's heated, it's much higher in terms of diesel equivalency. It's quite a range, actually. And you've got chemicals. A lot of these things are grown under plastic in huge areas in Spain and Italy, and not so much in the US, but there are greenhouse tomatoes, and so the greenhouse lies more in this side. Now they're throwing in distribution costs, which we weren't doing with the others, so may not be quite this high. Then there's one last one, which we haven't covered, and that's fishing and aquaculture. And so that includes all of these fish. This is a freshwater fish. The rest of these are saltwater. Some shellfish crawfish might be freshwater. So you almost have to double the amount of diesel equivalency because these are secondary and tertiary consumers. They're not primary consumers. So there's energy losses, remember, as you go up the energy pyramid. And some of these can be farmed in oceans and bays and coves. Be the same deal. But if you're going to fish out in the ocean, there's a lot of energy you got to expend to get your boats out there and get your nets or whatever you're using to catch the fish. I mean, so the other thing you can do is indoor farming, and that requires large tanks, water filtration, lighting, and so on. There was a piece last week on PBS NewsHour. Miles O'Brien was talking about these GMO salmon, and that got genes from maybe 4 or more genes from different species of fish, which made them extremely efficient in growing. And they could just utilize the food so well, and you could pack them tightly in tanks. But the problem with that is the high cost of water treatment. You got to get the water treated initially, and then when they're growing, you got to filter. They're producing so many wastes, you got to get that out, and then you can't let any of the DNA or any of this stuff get out in the wild. You got to treat the water as you're releasing it if you're doing that. But he said he couldn't taste any difference between these fish and regular salmon, which is kind of interesting. But on the other hand, Senator Lisa Murkowski called them frankenfish. And you can kind of figure out why she did that, because they would compete with Alaskan salmon. And so she didn't, Alaskans don't like these fish at all. I'm not saying they're gonna take off or anything. It's just an interesting tidbit about this. So this is kind of an interesting comparison. So it's all agriculture. We spend about 1% a year, but then when on the stuff out of our the energy that we have globally, it's higher. But this is an interesting fact check that 90-fold increase in global energy because of agrochemicals and fuels directly consumed by machinery. Agrochemicals are important. They come from petroleum, pretty much, methane and oil-based petroleum. So Smill will say 20%. I think Gates puts it a little lower. Now I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this. This is a very busy slide, and I apologize for it in advance, but it's trying to show how shipping and so forth changed in these time frames. And we had sailing ships, which are all wood, and they could get fairly large, but then when the steam engine was, the industrial era started with steamers, and that moved into ships, metal hulls, and they used coal, and they would take some add up weight on the ship, so they couldn't carry quite as much payload as some of the big sailing ships could, although they had more crew up here. But all of this stuff for steam power adds up. I'm going to kind of skip this communication is really shore to shore at this point. It's not so much ship to shore or ship to ship. So I'll not deal with that too much. But the first telegraph was around 1850, and then 30 years later was the first transcontinental phone line, I think, was laid. But you couldn't, once you left port, you were kind of on your own. You couldn't communicate very well. But as we move into the next era, which is a pretty big era, over 50 years. And by the way, the Titanic sank in 1912. And that was a pretty big steamer, well advanced, right? And it wasn't diesel powered, but that just gives you kind of a marker. Then we move into the ships are diesel powered. They're bigger. You get into airplanes with metal construction, the DC-3 that became the standard for all the warbirds in World War II and so forth. So these things kept progressing. And this is a big 23-year period. Things went bonkers. They really expanded very fast. The diesel powered ships are more efficient. gas turbine and jet engines for the airplanes, fan jets, very efficient, and so forth. So air cargo starts up, large oil tankers, and so forth. And everything just gets bigger as we move into the next 50, almost 50 years. Ship, you know, just a lot of ships. And of course, the container and passenger ships just get bigger and bigger. And at the very, you know, this isn't the very, this is sort of not quite midway, but this marker is important because 1990, China starts a growth period that's unbelievable. And it just keeps going to the present day, pretty much. Another busy slide. So that's globalization. He kind of stuffs that in between the three areas, but this is the last of the areas of materials that we need, and the four big pillars that take quite a bit of energy. According to Gates, 31% of all of our energy. Ammonia, steel, cement, and plastics. And most of the ammonia is used for fertilizer. I mean, you can use it for other things. Remember Timothy McVeigh loaded a truck, I don't know if it was a pickup or something bigger, of nitrate fertilizers and blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City. Well, it can be explosive, and I'm sure the federal government monitors all nitrate fertilizers from that point heavily, that point on. But what it does do is it allows 4 more billion people to live on Earth because of ammonia and those nitrogen-based fertilizers, which we'll talk more about that in the next slide or so. So we know steel, we know cement. To make cement, you got to heat limestone and CO2 comes off and so forth. But they build our cities, they build our infrastructure, they build everything, almost everything. We forget how much is in our world that's made up of steel and cement. One of the things that I have highlighted here is coal, which is a fossil fuel, is needed to make steel, and you won't get away from it. You need coke to make high carbon steel, and then you can process that further and get some of the carbon out, but you need to initially make it, and you won't get rid of that, okay? And you won't get rid of, if you're gonna make, I don't know how you're gonna make cement without getting rid of it. Some people say you can. I haven't heard much about alternatives. And plastics are everywhere. Just go into a hospital and look at all the equipment and tubes and the bags that are IV bags and syringes and this and that in a hospital, and the PPE. I mean, it's everywhere. Plastic, and these are the precursors for a lot of the other plastics that you see here. But so plastics are really the fastest growing thing in the last few years. I'll show you a slide in a moment. All the Halloween stuff that's out in our front yards is all plastic. You ever see? It's all plastic. I mean, if you look inside of a car, how much of it, the leather is basically plastic upholstery. I mean, it's everywhere. You know, covers wires as insulation. It's just all over the place. And some of it can be cancer causing and forever chemicals, and then it can build up. And we've had talks about that. Richard's given, some others have given talks about how it builds up in the environment. Okay, and that's horrible. I'm just going to go back to ammonia, this right up here. And Lee talked about this. This is a quick review. You have this pathway of starting with methane, and this is a blow up of this box here. So you get you get steam added to methane, and you're going to get CO2 coming off, and then that's called syngas. We could talk a whole lot more about syngas. We're not going to. It's important in biofuels, by the way. And then it keeps shifting, and we get rid of some more CO2. And so that's where the CO2 is coming from, the production of ammonia, NH3. But this process here, the Haber-Bosch process, takes, the nitrogen from the air, and from the air, nitrogen molecules, hydrogen, and processes it. They're coming in here, 1 to 3 by volume, and then they go through this reactor with some pressure, moderate temperature, and a catalyst. Then we get ammonia, chill it down. Excess gases go in with these gases, and it keeps going. Okay, now this is the source of CO2, but we could get rid of all of this if we could go green with electrolysis. So basically, this whole pathway goes away if you can go green with electrolysis and make it that way. So it could get cleaner. Okay, that's one thing I'll mention. So we have our ammonia. Then what happens to it? Okay, I'm not going to go into detail like this on the other three. They're just too plastics are too complex. But we have our environment, and a lot of the archaea bacteria, the prokaryotes, which are really old, and other prokaryotes, go through 2 processes. They take, by the way, this is a mistake. This should be NH3, not NH4. And the bacteria, some bacteria change it to nitrite and then to nitrate, which is a usable form of nitrogen. Why do plants need nitrogen? They need it to make amino acids, and the backbone of every amino acid has nitrogen atoms, and then you also need it in nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. So you got to, and this is the form they're going to absorb it pretty much in. All right. So the problem is it leaches from the soil. It's very dissolvable. So as it rains, it goes away. You got to keep adding it every year. And then it also goes away with pathways here, and then it gets changed to back to nitrite, nitric oxide, and then nitrous oxide. Now, not all the nitrous oxide goes back to nitrogen gas and goes into the atmosphere. Some of it goes straight to the atmosphere, okay? And that becomes a global warming molecule, okay? And as you can see here, global warming potentials, CO2 is, of course, going to be one. Everything's compared to CO2. Methane is 30. And I know Mert talked about the impact of methane far beyond that, because it changes into carbon dioxide. And then you have nitrous oxide, which is a very high global warming potential. So these are the approximate proportions that are created in all the global warming gases. All right. And they always say this over a 100-year period. I'm not sure why. So what Smil gets a little frustrated with the UN meetings, the Conference of Parties that started meeting every year since 1995. I think they met in Berlin here, they met in Madrid, Spain here, and last year they met in Scotland, right? But this, he says they don't get anything done. They don't hold anybody's feet to the fire, and they do some good reports. And but they project, well, if everybody went along with this and that, we'd be okay. But none of the big emitters don't do that. And he said from the first meeting to the 25th one, CO2 increased by 65%, methane by 25%. It's not going down, it's going up. Okay. So, yeah.
Could I add a comment here, Lou? I think it's a fascinating graph that you have up there. And just for the sake of the audience understanding, they might be a little puzzled why CO2 is given a much smaller number in terms of global warming potential than nitrous oxide, and yet the contribution is much lower for nitrous oxide. And the reason of that is twofold. Number one, that there's much less nitrous oxide in
exactly.
But there's another reason, and that is that both nitrous oxide and methane don't hang around as long. And so you have those two factors, I would imagine, causing this huge difference in the scale between global warming potential and the amount actually contributing to global warming. So both the longevity and the concentration lead to this enormous difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I should have meant, yeah, because there's not that much of this leaking, but when the little bit that does, it has a large impact.
Yeah,
Of the nitrous
it's
oxide.
a striking table. And
Yeah.
just wanted to mention, make sure we're aware that there are two things contributing to that huge difference. Yeah, I think your talk is just great, where there's so much to absorb here, and sometimes a little faster than the mind can pick it all up. There's a huge amount of information here. Go ahead.
Well, okay, we'll try to go through it, but Smil is just not real confident in Conference of Parties, and you know, the International Energy Agency has its own publications too that they put out. That's somewhat, and all these things, it just doesn't feel. You know, he says 50,000 people go converge into each one of these conferences for several weeks, a couple of 2 or 3 weeks, and the carbon footprint they create isn't helping things. Yeah, Greta Thunberg has made that point again and again with things, but he says kind of not a good thing. All right, so this, I'm just going to review some. We lost our. So during this period of time, ammonia increases 8-fold from 1950 to 73. All of these these amounts of plastics really high. And if you add these up, they're not going to add up to what Smil says is the, which is something like 25%. So he's saying it's 25, and Gates says it's higher, and possibly because Gates says it's higher, could be a couple of factors, but one could be the contribution of nitrous oxide from ammonia, so that cranks this number up to 10 or 12, and then that would give you the 31%. But anyway, there's other things we're making than just the 4 pillars too, than just these 4. I don't know what percent they would really be. They're never really mentioned elsewhere, but maybe somebody would know. So humanity has a very deep and protracted dependency on fossil fuels, is what we're trying to get at this point. So what do we do? Okay.
Could I add another, just a
Yeah.
very quick thought here? And I think the point that both Smil and Gates are making is that we talk about the low-hanging fruit of improving the grid and reducing emissions from transportation. And what I think they're both getting across here is that we're going to be dependent long after we fix transportation and the grid on these 4 basic elements. And,
you're right.
Absolutely. And that's a much tougher fruit to handle. And not everybody, for those of you who couldn't come to the wonderful field trip a week ago, you can see how they were able to deal with some of these things by good planning and building construction. And I didn't realize till we've been there that it has the best LED rating of any building in the world. I thought it was Dane County. And Hansen claimed, I presume he's right to make that claim, that it's the best LEED rating in the world. Pretty spectacular. It's a fascinating place to visit. And I will try and send out a little summary someday for those who live too far away and were unable to attend. But that sort of demonstrates how difficult it's going to be to deal with these 4 elements. Oh,
it is. And yeah, he makes that point. They're all looking at the grid and they're not looking beyond that.
Yeah.
Okay, the next slide. This is his list of things that he mentions, SUVs, and there's 250 million in use. He says this eclipses even long haul trucks. All of, people, there's a lot of pro of global warming mitigation folks, but then they're driving an SUV. I mean, they have a big house, big vehicle, and I'm guilty of that myself, unfortunately. I am a Ford F-150, and that's my only vehicle, although it gets really good gas mileage. Anyway, less traveling by car and jet planes, and that includes military, corporate. And I see all these corporate airplanes flying to Executive Airport, which is a small airport that a lot of the business jets use, both turboprop and jet. And why do they need to be flying around so much with these planes? What is it that they have to do? I don't know. And the military, when they, those afterburners kick in on jets, they're just using fuel like you can't believe. We had a couple of Air Force fellows that made that point. We always had 2 of them every year when the last few years at Argonne, and they would just say, the fuel that the military uses is really immense. And those jets, when they're, it's great to make movies like Top Gun Maverick, but there's a carbon footprint there that you got to reckon with. And personal too. People fly. I've been interested in EAA, and there's a lot of people who fly their own personal aircraft. I mean, that all leaves a footprint. And I know Smill would not like any of this. He didn't mention it in his book, but he wouldn't. The interesting thing about EAA AirVenture is a lot of the big exhibitors that sell big planes, that jets and turboprops and others, they sell a lot during that week of AirVenture, and that's why you get all these big sponsorships. They're making money during that week. But how does this move forward? As with why is all this necessary? Anyway.
Let me just add a little remark there, if I may, Lou. The first 10 years of this century, from about 2000 to 2010, they pushed innovations, and they pushed fuel efficiency and electric airplanes. And now there's much less of that in the last decade. I think it depends who's the chair of EAA, but I totally with you on this point. EAA could be setting a trend. Fortunately, there are other organizations that are working on it to precede EAA, various organizations trying to promote more efficient aircraft. Just a little comment just to throw out to anybody who wants to look up. There's a company called Joby, Joby aircraft.
Yeah.
I want to get really, there are dozens of companies, but I think that one has the greatest opportunity for the future.
Yep.
If you Google Joby aircraft, you'll see something positive coming out of, not out of EAA, but they do show up at EAA, and they're making real attempts at cutting back on, because we really need to have more effort. And I think it's a shame that EAA goes where the money is, and I wish they would get a little bit more, like you, interested in cutting back on fuel consumption. Okay.
And I noticed those very same observations you said, because they used to do more of the cutting edge stuff, and they're not, I don't know. Okay, next few points. Eat less. We overeat. No more than 2,200 calories for men, probably less for women, and reduce our food waste. I mean, you're not going to get 40% food waste is pretty high. That's what's projected. You're not going to get it to 0, but get it down, and don't waste so much. Eat less beef, and there's 2 reasons why for that. The amount of energy to make a pound of beef is the highest of all livestock, and then you got the methane that they produce, and that's dairy, all beef and dairy cattle. And then he says well, this is stuff we've been told about for over 10 years, I think, and the standards are changing in new construction. to put in better windows and insulation. But when you look at Gates's number for the amount of energy, is only 6%, 7% in residential, commercial. That would, and of that, this would be a subset of that even. Some additional items that he doesn't mention: use of heat pumps, induction ovens. We've heard that from other presenters recently. Gets rid of the methane, right? We don't need to use methane. Decarbonize long haul trucking. That's 2 million trucks in use, 28 billion hours of operation per year. I said before this started that maybe biofuels could cut half the carbon footprint of aviation, and maybe some other. It's not going to bring it down to 25%, but it could cut it in half. It might be useful. You can use food waste, if you can collect it efficiently, to make biofuels. I mean, you can make any fuel you want with biofuels. The chemistry is there. It's not that difficult to do, but it's got its limits. And then slow down the building of gas plants. They have a 40-year lifespan investment. Okay, how long are we going to keep using those 40? From this point into the future. I mean, 2060 and 2070, we're going to be using those. And then big banks and insurance companies must stop financing fossil fuel projects. Problem with these last two, you can't do those right away because what's your alternative? You got to have an alternative to each of them, and where is the alternative? That's sort of a rhetorical question. Go. You had something, Richard?
Yeah. I think you should include in item D, slow the building of gas plants. The best way to slow the building of gas plants is to use nuclear plants.
There you go.
Because at the moment we're using gas plants to deal with the intermittency of wind and solar, and we should be the way to do that, to slow the building of the gas plants, which everybody ignores. They're being built helter-skelter to back up wind and solar. We should be switching to small nuclear plants, and as they get smaller in size, you don't have to build them way out in the boonies. You can build them closer to where the material is used, where the energy is used.
Right, good point. Well, these were built to get rid of coal. Now they got to be replaced at some point with something else. Absolutely. Okay. They were, all right, some of this, he gets into a lot of failed thinking, and there may be some disagreement with a number of you in some of these things, but I listed these all in one slug. Catastrophists. Well, we had Paul Ehrlich. He released a book in 1970 called Population Bomb, and we could not get to 4 billion people. If we did, we'd have famine, disease, pandemics, all kinds of problems. We'd never get there. Well, we far exceeded that. Then this idea of lack of global cooperation, and these are serious things. I mean, we got to have everybody cooperate more or less together very quickly. Lack of effective long-term corporate and government policies, that sort of spins off of the second bullet. Pandemics, which we know we've experienced, the supply chain issues are caused, and that we've still not gotten those straightened out. Loss of forests and healthy oceans, and not just rainforest, tropical rainforest, but also regular deciduous forests are not growing the way they once were. Their trees aren't as big, and they're not carrying on as much photosynthesis as they used to. And the oceans are a big area. We got tensions, water. Water is going to be a big issue between countries, and people are going to flee one country to go to another, and then create all kinds of tensions possible. Well, we have a war going right now. We know what that does to energy. We're seeing it right in front of our eyes. And then this idea of modeling, McCabe is not a big modeler. He doesn't like, and that could be a whole nother discussion about modeling. There was a PBS Nova on last week about crime and computers, where they tried to model crime to prevent crime, and never worked. Just caused some problems, and I won't get into why. It just didn't work very well. So maybe he's got some points about that. But then you get into tipping points where you get positive feedbacks like methane being released in the Arctic, and then we're adding methane anthropogenically, and you know, maybe there's a tipping point. That's frustrating to people. Then we don't see any hope. Okay. Then you have the other side with the near miraculous solutions, AI and singularity. He mentioned this several times in the book. Ray Kurzweil, a long time ago, predicted that machine intelligence would equal human intelligence by this date. And once it happened, watch out, that we're going to have to merge with the machines. You know, it's the Terminator series kind of thing. But, you know, he mentioned, but some people believe this, that, you know, once we get that intelligence out there, we can solve anything. Okay. Unlimited efficiency and optimization gains, like all these different reactions to make plastics or this or that. You know, it's not unlimited, and it can be optimized just so much, and you hit walls. You can't do it forever. Renewables, energy storage make up 90% of all energy requirements. Mr. Mark Jacobson from Stanford University, he doesn't believe that is remotely possible. Here's the big bullet that some of you may not like. He doesn't believe fission can do 80% of all energy either. Pre-1980, a lot of people believed that fission was going to power the whole grid, and then there were going to be breeder reactors to make fuel forever into the future. And he doesn't. I can read it. I don't want to read the excerpt from the book, but he says what happened in the last 30, 40 years, it just hasn't materialized since 1980. And these are my comments. The things that I've run into is, well, you have certification, licensing issues, and then unfortunately, when a lot of reactors are built, fission projects are started, they don't get finished, and the timelines get extended and the cost overruns grow, and one reinforces the other and so forth. And that, back in the Jimmy Carter era, we had a real high inflation period, and that actually shut down a lot of projects back in there because investors got spooked. You see cost overruns and they don't like it, you know. So fission's going to have to deal with some of these issues to be viable, to be the viable thing that we all would like it to be. And then the last thing, sustained fusion and its expansion. We know there are so many problems. Well, there's a lot of research going on because of magnets with tokamak reactors and things, but there's still so many things to solve with this. What he's saying is these percentages are just too high, is what he said. You gotta work more to the middle and not by the far extremes. And this isn't even here yet. And you just can't do things. There's no one panacea to solve this. Just isn't. Okay. All right. So we'll move on. Remember this graph? I do want to, I've just got a couple slides left, a few left to go on. This one is the share of fossil fuel. And we had this number between 72% by 2040. Well, I'm going to refer back to that. Before I do, though, note that even if you know, warming is a latent response. Global warming is latent. Temperature rise continues 25 to 35 years after launching a large decarbonization effort. And it's got to be global. Can't be anything but global. If it's not going to work. But 20 to 25 years latency, even though you could plateau the GHGs, the CO2 plateaus, you're still going to keep climbing in temperature for 20 to 25 years. That's what he was saying in the book. So this is a possible trajectory, and this is based on a current 83% share of fossil fuel. He says it never goes completely to zero, just doesn't. And, you know, by 2030, launch a 15% global curtailment. Maybe you can get in the 15%. The Green New Deal was at 45. Green New Deal got really high here. It was maybe above 45, I don't know. There's some scenarios that are way beyond this. He says that's just not gonna, you're not gonna pull that together by 2030. It isn't gonna happen. Observe a 60% share globally by 2040. So that's in between the 72 and 56% that we saw. That's something in between. And then maybe plateau, we can really accelerate things between 2040, that's a 20-year period, maybe 25 years, and get in this territory and really start to plateau GHGs in parts per million. And really, you know, it's not going to just, it may need a range. But then he says, we're not going to plateau temperatures until the next century. It's doubtful, and it's going to plateau at these pre-industrial levels of Celsius, okay, somewhere in this range. But we'll start to see some economic benefit by 1980. So that's really delaying the trajectory by a huge amount compared to what most of us are being told or we're hearing or seeing.
By 2080, you mean?
Yeah, that you're going to see some benefits going on. And he doesn't say that it's going to be maybe that the rise of temperature may slow down, but not, the rise will still continue in some fashion, probably. So basically, that's what this is the trajectory. Okay. And I just got like a couple slides left. So serious questions for humanity. The first bullet, will each nation rally its citizens and accept consistent policies to curb fossil fuels and reduce consumption? Consistent. If you get a new administration in, are they going to just wipe everything out like we saw Donald Trump do? That isn't going to work. That won't work. Then we're into citizens and corporations of rich nations. Will they sacrifice things, their quality of life, drive smaller vehicles, fly and eat less, and so forth? And then will they share resources or any breakthroughs for the poor developing nations, which are sub-Saharan Africa? Okay. And will the top 7 emitters, which is China, India, United States, the EU, Russia, and there's some more, maybe Indonesia, will they decarb at the same time? If they don't, we got problems. It's just not going to go anywhere very effectively. They all have to decarbonate pretty much together and really have hard levels that they're going to try to reach. Then this is the last, you know, will current generations, I'm talking about boomers, millennials, Generation X, will we all be altruistic enough? None of us participating today are going to see a decline in temperatures. Global temperatures will continue to rise and when we're long gone, right? Will the generations be altruistic enough? Will they say, hey, this is still important for the future of the earth and we're going to make that change? Then this is pretty much the last slide. I'm just going to compare Gates and Smill. Gates wrote the book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And, you know, it's kind of a blueprint for zero carbon emissions. It's really net zero, not absolute zero. It's net zero. There's a difference. But the subheading explains the green premiums, the technologies we have, but then the breakthroughs that we need, and he's funded a bunch of these. You know, he's very philanthropic and has thrown $500 million, $1 billion at a lot of these efforts, including fusion, including Gen 4 fission, and so on. He's thrown money at that and not expecting all of them to succeed. I'm sure he doesn't expect that. He said that in the book. But this is sort of kind of like a blueprint. It's an easy book to read, and you get a good feeling when you read it. However, this is a book just before. This is one of the books right around the release of how the world really works, and it's called Growth, from Microbes to Megacities. He gets very down about things in this book, saying we have to decouple growth from material consumption. I mean, in other words, things are going to get really tough, and we have to cut back on material consumption. There's a lot of ways we can do that, and growth has to come to an end in some countries, but allowed in others. And sub-Saharan Africa, for one. And if the developed countries don't learn to manage growth, they're going to succumb to it. So, this is very dystopian. And the last thing, there is no roadmap to zero emissions. And these two, Part Company, is much more dystopian and apocalyptic than is Gates. So that's kind of depressing ending to we saw this slide before. So sub-Saharan African countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and many Congo, and they're going to add another 1 billion people by 2045 to the globe if we can keep the number of people we have. So that's going to really strain things. So how do you deal with that? They feel it's, they have a right to be where China is, or where we, the EU, all of these countries, they deserve to be higher than this. So that's going to be a strain. And this is the last quote, and this is my last slide. There will be advances, setbacks, and failures, no assurance of ultimate success. As long as we use our accumulated understanding with determination and perseverance, we will survive. The future is not predetermined. Its outcome is dependent on our actions. And that's the last slide. So I can stop the share. And what do I do, Richard, to open this up to everybody?
If you hit the unshare, we should see a bunch of people who can put up their hands. While you're doing that, let me read some of the chats, okay? For start things off.
Absolutely.
George Erickson says, please go to www.tundracub.com. Click on the child's picture in the lower right corner of the homepage to see Time to Get Serious. Good point, George. Your website is excellent. You keep it up to date, and I recommend that as well. Lee Gasper Galvin says, a little update on what I said about electric motors. She says the electric motor in the Tesla Model 3 is 95% efficient. That's an interesting number. You're probably right, Lee. You know more about it than I do as an engineer, but seems a little high to me. But it would be nice if it's true. I know it's just lovely to be able to touch the accelerator and feel the power, and I think that's why most people buy them, because their responsiveness in traffic, not because they feel they're doing the planet any good. But I think more people are catching on now. I drove to the Chicago area last weekend and spent $20 on electricity getting there and back. And I think gasoline would have been four times that. So
Richard, can you hear me?
Nice way to go. Yes, I can, Lee.
Do you remember Professor Ladois from the electrical engineering department from UW Madison when he came and gave a talk?
Yes.
I went up and talked to him afterwards, and I said, what's the most efficient electric motor available now? When you were saying 80%, that is what it used to be. Years ago was 80% typically for efficiency of electric motors. But when I asked Professor Lados that question, as I recall, his answer was 95 to 97%, because they've come up with so many new styles of electric motors. They've just become much, much more efficient over time.
Okay, well, thank you for elaborating on that.
Can I just make one quick point on the Smil says there's about 110, there's right now about 1 million EVs on the road, and there's 250 million SUVs, so 250 to 1 ratio, and they don't begin to counterbalance all the SUV and extra gas that they're burning, 25% more than an average gasoline vehicle. And by 2040, he's projecting 100 million, or I'm sure the auto industry is projecting higher than that.
Well, they can't make them fast enough, Lou, is part of the inhibition, plus the cost is high. But it is going to evolve. When people see that the cost of fuel at the present time is 1/4 with an electric vehicle, that's a huge difference. And people are going to just get fed up. Not only the inconvenience of having to go to a gas station, although people don't find that inconvenient. I just love the convenience of being able to plug in at home. We had a former speaker here, forgetting his name, but he was a professor who loved Teslas, and people could ask him, well, how long does it take to charge your car? And he'd say 4 seconds. And I said, what do you mean 4 seconds? He said, well, 2 seconds to plug in and 2 seconds to pull out the plug. That was a good
That's
answer.
human input.
Yeah, right, exactly. Lee has another comment here. I'd just like to whip through these. She says, just because you can't taste any difference, it doesn't mean that there isn't any difference in how the GMO fish interacts with your body. It could be carcinogenic, for example, without long-term data, who knows? It's an interesting point, and I think that I'm quite interested in salmon, my favorite fish, and I think we do need to do a little more research on farmed salmon as opposed to wild salmon. But I can tell you one thing, if it were not for farmed salmon, the wild salmon and many other fish, including, tilapia is mostly farmed, but a lot of other fish, we'd have been big problems if there were not fish farming today. But I'm not saying that it's always safe, and we do need to look into that. Alan says, the EAA Adventure is the world's largest source of carbon emissions for what is essentially entertainment of aviation interests. Interesting point. I didn't realize it was the world's largest source of carbon emissions during that week, but I suppose it's true. Alan, thank you for sharing that. I can say that there needs to be more awareness. The only thing I can say on behalf of aviation is if you look at either Bill Gates' book, I'm not sure whether this is in Smil's book as well, if you look at the actual percent of emissions that come from airplanes, as opposed to all the other things on the map, I think it's below 6%, somewhere around closer probably to 3%. So we've got a lot of other areas, including all the trucks and SUVs that can be improved with electric transportation, and I'm sure will be with time. Lee makes another point here, says, raise food prices in rich countries. Who's going to suffer? The poor in those countries. Food prices are already projecting too high. Steve Schellen says solar panels, just lost it, there it is, only have a 20 to 25 year lifetime. Very good point, Stephen. Dorothy says, farmed fish have lower omega fatty acids that are beneficial. A fascinating point, and thank you. I think that's true, Dorothy.
It is true. It is true of tilapia. And the good fats the bad fats are in tilapia, and the good fats are in salmon.
Yeah. The omega-3 fatty acids are good for some people. So it's not bad to get that too. I think we've got through those. Let's look at some hands up here. Let's look at, we're in the chat function. Do we have any hands up?
Well, there were two. Tony had his hand up.
Tony, do you want to?
So does George.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Tony?
Okay, let's see, a couple things in relationship to the two writers that we talked about, Smill and Gates. No doubt about it, Gates is an optimist. He's a technologist. I read his book. I've met him in the past. I think he's fantastic. I actually knew his sister much better than I knew him. I only met him at a couple conferences. But I think what he is trying to do for society and executing in his philanthropic approaches towards investing in different types of industry, nuclear being one of them, cement being another, and others besides, or he's trying to come up with solutions that'll be practical and cost effective for the long term. That's not always the case, unfortunately. We don't always use technology in the best manner possible. One case, of course, is when we change, if I remember, it was Freon that we used to put in air conditioners and refrigerators. That was changed over to hydrocarbons. So we fixed, to some extent, we helped the ozone area, but on the other, those hydrocarbons are somewhere in the area of 1,400. If you were to release the hydrocarbon out of all the air conditioners and refrigerators in the world, it is definitely a serious problem. Now, I think we've got our act together in correcting that as far as the long term is concerned, and going to the right one, which is still yet, I think, a couple of years away as far as replacing the hydrocarbons that we use currently. So just a couple of comments. Lou, I think you did an excellent job of presenting. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation and points that you brought up. So.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. George has his hand up. Yes, George.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay. I think it's important to know that across the world, in response to climate change, 20 other nations are expanding nuclear power. Compare that to the United States, where we have to fight to keep our current plants open, largely due to the willful ignorance of outfits like the Sierra Club and 350.org, who the leaders of those organizations' salaries depends on continuing fear of nuclear power. Secondly, when we talk about expanding nuclear power, I think it's important to make the point that we don't have to build a whole new plant. We could go to an existing carbon burning power plant and with some of the modular reactors, replace the heat source and keep all the rest of the technology. So it isn't a case of replacing the whole works. It's basically the heat source. And then finally, I saw a news release. As most of you know, the oceans are a great sink for carbon dioxide. They absorb a lot, which incidentally is damaging their chemistry. However, there are limits to that. And this news release said that the Mediterranean can no longer absorb more carbon dioxide. It is apparently at a saturation point. And what has happened there can happen elsewhere. That's it.
That's interesting. I was thinking, I know somebody had done research on phytoplankton, but if you, in the Arctic, to make them more efficient as the temperatures go up, but is there some way to engineer phytoplankton to absorb more CO2? If the oceans could pull out more CO2, that to me would be a more logical choice than direct carbon sequestration by machines.
Well,
that just doesn't seem to have any chance of working. I don't know. Direct carbon sequestration, you know, this is crazy. Go ahead.
It has been suggested that we add finely powdered lime to the oceans. But when I hear that proposal, I think of the carbon footprint of that process and how much you would need. Also, finely powdered basalt.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. But it's a scale thing. The scale of that is immense. How would you do, I mean, how would you get by with it?
Yeah, that's an issue that we have touched on. Alex Canara has talked about doing that, and he's gone into the details, the math fairly well. And even in Alex's portrayal, he had conventional ships doing that job. I think we could have nuclear powered ships doing that job instead, which would lower down the carbon footprint of doing that. I think that when I gave a talk recently on the subject, it was interesting to discuss the concern in not only in terms of cost in scaling, but also in terms of danger to the environment. And this is being considered carefully by a number of organizations. The Ocean Conservancy is working with other organizations internationally to try and plan and deal with ocean acidification, but it's definitely, I agree with you, George, an urgent need, and we need to think globally rather than nationally as we proceed to deal with ocean acidification.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts out there?
Yeah, my one final thought is the same one I always have. We have to talk to the public. We have to seek out opportunities to share this knowledge in a rather, let's say, simplified way that doesn't turn off the listener. Because this is wonderful to be able to share this stuff, but we need to educate the public because our legislators are drawn from the public and they don't know any more about this than the public does.
Very good point. We have a wonderful young nuclear influencer now, George. You may have heard of her, Isabel Bomeke, and she has just given a TED talk recently. I've sent it around to our Friends of Fishing group, but maybe I should send it more broadly to this entire group. She is inspiring and has done her due research. Not a scientist, she's a model, but she has a way to catch young people of today, and maybe not the people in government as much as we'd like, but at least the public who are voting. And I think it would be good to listen to her and think about comments she has to make. I'm preparing a talk for next February entitled Let's Not Lose Hope, or something like that, to that effect. I've forgotten, I haven't settled on a final title, but it involves some of her ideas. She has a comment that says climate change is important. Nuclear is good. And the third comment is, but everybody hates it. And we need to change that. And she's working hard to do that. So she's a powerful influencer, and it's nice to see that happening. I got a question for you, Lou, while we have a Smell on the topic. He comes from University of Manitoba, is that correct? But
that's correct.
I'd like to know, what's his origin? Is he Eastern European, from Hungary?
He's Czech. He's Czechoslovakian.
Okay.
And he grew up under the Soviet regime, he said, for his first 26 years. And he hated all the propaganda they were throwing out, how great everything was going to be. Yeah. He didn't believe, and he had to leave. He got out, and then he went to Canada, I guess. I don't know where he all went to school, but he's a Czech.
Yeah. Thank you. He's an interesting writer. I like the way, I really enjoyed your talk, Lou. I like several things. One of the things that I thought was really key is your comparisons with Bill Gates. Those were really nice slides.
Yeah.
I appreciate you putting that together.
And it is an interesting comparison.
Yeah, it really was.
Gates, I think, is more open to modeling.
Yes.
He is not. And modeling does have some questions that you gotta Yeah, but I think there's been a lot of modeling in argon and so forth, and I can't believe all these scientists are all doing something all wrong. I don't know, but they make a lot of assumptions. But anyway, you know, the whole thing is, you know, we're so entrenched with fossil fuels, we just don't realize it. And that try to get away from it is going to be really hard. And Gates tries to say that, but Schmiel gives you examples of just how it's just built up our whole modern world. It's just done that. And it's just going to be difficult.
He is a positive guy. I was struck with what you just said when I went to, I had a visitor from France, a young woman who's working on her master's degree. She's interested in ecology. So I took her to a couple of meetings, field trips. One of them was with the Audubon Society. And we went, and there were about 20 cars showed up at this most beautiful little valley south of Black Earth called Pleasant Valley. And we looked at butterflies and had a wonderful time. But as I noticed going back to my car, I had the only fuel efficient car in the lot. Everybody else was driving an SUV. And I guess the Audubon Society don't want to get stuck in a dirt path somewhere. So they insisted on driving SUVs, but they sure weren't thinking about the environment very much when they chose those cars.
Richard?
Yes.
Richard? This young woman you spoke about, is she from Brazil?
Yes, she is. Yep.
Yeah, I thought so. I saw two of her presentations and they were very good.
Yeah.
And I spent some time on the web and sent her a message.
Good for you.
But I haven't gotten an answer yet.
Good luck.
If you don't TikTok, you might be just a little follower, but yeah, she's. I think she's going to be invited to more and more nuclear meetings in the future because she's a bright source of optimism, which we need in this field. We can say, well, we're all thinking tribally, we need to think globally, but we also need to be optimistic, and I guess that's why I kind of couldn't help but be attracted by Bill Gates as opposed to Schmiel. He's a great guy, and he's giving us a lot of important information. Particularly, I think the whole idea of net zero and as opposed to real zero, and that's an important concept. But we need some optimism as well.
Right.
I'll just get discouraged.
But you can possibly plateau temperatures and still do that with net zero. The globe has ways of binding up the absorbing the CO2, not just with forests and everything, but and oceans. But so you don't have to get gigatons of CO2 equivalents down to zero. You probably can have it a little bit above and still get the result we want, you know.
Yeah. The other thing is measuring the results. I think it's wonderful that they do this and have been doing it now for 50 years or so in Hawaii, on top of this volcano. I'm trying to remember the name of the curve. There's a guy.
Keeling.
That's it. Pardon?
Keeling.
Spell it out.
I think it was Keeling.
Keeling, that's it. Thank you. Keeling curves. Those are, his son has now carried on his father's work, and that's being done, I believe, twice a year. And it used to be going up by 1 part per million per year, 1.5. Then it got up to 2, and now we're getting close to 3 parts per million per year. So even though we've been talking about climate change for 20 years, I'd say pretty aggressively, it's only come into political thought in the last couple of years, serious political thought, where people are ranking it in the Democratic Party, at least, possibly not much in the Republican Party yet, but people are starting to think about it within these parties. And the way to, and so it's interesting to see the evolution in our thinking, and we clearly have a way to go yet, because it's not only going up, but it's accelerating. 3 parts per million per year is not a good track. We need to get it down to 0 in terms of increase.
Right.
And it will still take a long time from then to start going down, as you bring out very well, Lou, in today's talk. I think Lou's talked about, Schmiel talked about 40 years. that's an interesting guess. I hope it's as short as that. I
Well,
would-
he was saying 25 to 35, but yeah, it
I
could
think
be
it
longer.
could be
We
longer
don't
than
know.
that.
We don't really
Yeah,
know
no.
that period.
No, it's an important number
Yeah,
for at least for human survival. And one thing that doesn't factor into any of these is the social chaos from climate migrants. This could be really very unsettling to try and come up with any kind of international agreements if we're overwhelmed with migrants. So we need to work as fast and as efficiently as we can. And getting back to George's point, promote not just nuclear, but nuclear is a very important avenue and a solution. I thought you brought up very well, George, by pointing out that all these other countries are building nuclear and we're still stuck with trying to keep the ones we have afloat. But I did give a talk, I think, fairly recently on the number of small modular reactors. There are 30 or more under design, and Russia and China have them already working, or Russia especially, but we will be pretty soon, and we certainly need to support that.
right. I think I came across the stat that 63 reactors were brought into service between 2011 and 2020. 63 reactors. And there's hardly, is there any in the US? I don't think so. Is there that were brought in? No. Yeah.
No.
So
We have decreased.
yeah.
So we're about to add the one in Vodal. They're
Yeah.
very close to finishing, and that would
Are
be
they?
They're loading fuel in Vodal 3.
Yep.
And they should have probably some power near the end of the year or early
That's great.
2023.
those are big reactors too. They're over
Yeah.
1,000 megawatts.
Well, actually, that's overall, they're more efficient than the modular reactors, but
Yes. That's true.
the barrier of financing and the time to build is never able to be considered by our financial structure. And the
Yeah.
millstone around the necks of nuclear power is the government's overregulation, under promotion, and the personal objectives of the people at the top just don't correspond to any of what we're talking about today.
Do you think, Stephen, that there's any possibility that summer reactor could be resurrected, or is it gone?
I don't think it could be resurrected in its originally planned form because of all of the negatives that have been thrown at Bodil. I think the impetus has shifted to modular,
Yeah.
and even though they're not going to be overall as efficient as a large plant, they may be able to be, because of the small size, because of manufacturing off-site, although there's still a considerable on-site construction that's required, they're probably going to be the way we go for a while till we find out we can't build enough for a long-term operation. You know, the current nuclear plants that we have are really designed for 80 to 100 years of operation. When you look at the specifications, the only real modification or maintenance you need are the normal industrial things like pumps and motors and valves. The nuclear portion has 100-year lifetime.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really positive. And George made the interesting point called now C2N, the letter C for coal, 2, the number 2 for TO, and N, of course, for nuclear. And this idea of inserting perhaps a bank of small modular reactors to make them build so you don't have the cost overruns and then hook them up to the existing grid setup that's there and the steam system that's there, that could reduce costs and make the transition more effective.
The other thing nuclear does is that what you would call the, Richard, waste heat that produces extra heat that could help drive industrial processes, the four pillars that Smil talks about, and still produce electricity that could be used by a company or residentially nearby. I mean, you could use a lot more of the energy of a modular reactor to do a lot of different things. And it would be a real boom. I would think it would be a real positive for the whole industry.
I agree.
Well, the demonization of nuclear power in the U.S. has required plants to be located with 10, 15, 20-mile exclusion or limited occupancy zones, whereas places like Switzerland, they put it on an island in the middle of a city, and they've been operating without any problem for decades. An example would be Milwaukee has an excellent steam supply system for the majority of the major buildings in downtown Milwaukee run off of a coal plant. The coal plant has been switched to natural gas, and it would take only that same footprint to put a 1,000-megawatt nuclear plant in Milwaukee and supply heat for practically the whole county.
Great. Richard?
In addition to all the electricity would apply for southeast Wisconsin.
Yes, very good point, Stephen. Thank you for that. Yes, George.
Couple points. I think the Navy, a good point to make when talking to the public, the Navy effectively almost has done the same thing. We power our submarines with a reactor, but they didn't just make a great big reactor to power the aircraft carriers. They're modular. I don't know how many units they have, but it's basically multiple small units. The logic being, if you have a problem with one, you're not out of business. You have the remainder. And then there's eventually less of a refueling problem because they can be staggered. And then, is there a way, I have an image, is there a way I can share it? Can I just click share screen?
Well, you're not a co-host, so I'm not sure, but you could try it.
Okay, well, I'll do it and we'll see what happens. Oh, it's disabled. Okay, that's all right. It's basic, I'll describe it. The coal miners in Australia run ads that say nuclear power will kill the coal industry. I like to use that when I give presentations, because people need to know that elsewhere in the world, they come right out and say it, but we don't hear.
Yes, and not only that, but they're so wrong because they could increase their wages considerably, as well as the cleanliness of their work environment, if they would switch to nuclear power. Australia is just beginning to wake up, I think, to the need to go nuclear. They're still very much opposed to it. And they keep changing prime ministers from one year to the next because there's still a lot of public dissatisfaction with the idea.
To answer one of George's questions, the normal aircraft carrier has 2 nuclear reactors. The Enterprise had 8. A submarine has 1. When we decommission a submarine, remove it from service, take it out of the water, we simply send it up to Bremerton, Washington, cut out the nuclear section and haul it to the Hanford site, and there's a burial place there. So we have a number of modular reactors sitting there that could be moved around the country and refitted, revitalized, and run again.
Wow.
The government would not allow it, though.
Well, of course
Thanks
not.
for that. It's interesting insight. Appreciate that, Stephen. Yes, Lou.
No, I have nothing to add.
It's 20 to 12.
Yeah.
And, but we've still got a little time if anybody would like to chip in. Just to remind you that we have Neil Alexander next Monday, who's talking on updates on Canadian small modular reactor developments. He's very knowledgeable on that. I think Neil has a fairly balanced approach. He can see the benefits of small modular reactors. I think he can also see the hazards of accepting them too readily without thinking of some of the negatives, such as the reduced efficiency and other things. But he strikes me as a guy with a good balance, and represents a country where they do not have as much negativism in the regulation as we have in our Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So he can look ahead and also see some of the positive interactions between Canada and the United States. So I think we can look forward to some good insights from Neil. He's spoken to us a couple of times in the past. So I encourage you all to join us next week. It'll be just like this. It'll be pure online, and we won't fool around with hybrid until November 7th. So we've got a little time to prepare for that. So this will be very much like today's talk. And I have alerted Neil that we'll have these sessions like we're having now. So there's a little more opportunity for question and answer. So it'll be in this model next week. Any other thoughts or comments?
Well, thank you very much, Lou. It was a very good presentation.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you guys stuck with it. It's not the most upbeat thing, but it's somewhat reality.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can change some of the reality that you heard at the end. So,
Realism these days is not very upbeat.
no, it isn't, but it's I think the guy's a great thinker, McClave Smil. He's certainly historically gone through everything to the hilt, and you got to listen to people on all sides, you know.
But you constructed, I think, Lou, not only some of his tables, but you did the nice comparisons between him and Bill Gates.
Yeah,
which
he had no tables or figures in the book, nothing.
Okay, there you go. So we're grateful to you for a lot of nice summarizing.
It's all text.
I've read a little bit of his stuff, and this was upbeat, I think, in some ways over Smil's books himself. So I appreciate all that work. I've taken a lot of screenshots, and of course that will be available to all of you very soon when Stephanie gets them posted at platomadison.org recorded sessions. So, and you all have that, I think, in your.
If anybody really wanted a power PDF of the PowerPoint, I could send it to them. I mean, this isn't
Sure.
something I want to hoard. I mean, if you want a copy of it, I'd be glad to send it. Just you have to get my email address or something.
Well, they wouldn't get your words of wisdom from the slides. That would be on the website, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But
that's
sometimes,
good. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you again, everyone, for attending and staying with it. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lou. It's a great talk. Appreciate it. So long, everybody.
Bye.
Hello.
Bye-bye.